So please stick around after the film for our conversation with Norma Rantisi. Dr. Rantisi is a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment who is interested in urban political economy, including the socio-spatial organization of workforce development initiatives and alternative economies. She is also working on a project on Palestinian women's artisanal cooperatives. So please stick around and enjoy the film.
Okay. First, I wanted just to thank Cinema Politica for doing this and for always hosting these amazing films. I wanted to thank the organizers of Israeli Apartheid Week for all the work, the tireless work they do to make these events possible, and Mohammed for his role in and support in these events too. I'm Palestinian American, now technically Palestinian American Canadian, and my first visit to the West Bank was at the tail end of the Intifada in 1991. At the time, I was in university, and I was active with some organizing that was going on in solidarity with the first Intifada, but I was based in Chicago. And from a distance, much of what I would see, similar, I think, to much what as many would see at that time were the media shots of mainly a lot of youth on the street throwing rocks. And so we really saw the kind of the clashes, the army, the youth, and constant battle and so forth. And also at the time, and some of the context is raised in the film, that the kind of government information, there were two governments, really, in operation. But for people who were outside of Palestine, outside of the West Bank, outside of Gaza and the organizing that was going on, the government in our minds was the PLO. So it wasn't so immediately apparent what was going on the ground in terms of governance, in terms of institution building. So my mother had decided that I seemed quite interested and invested in what was going on, and that I should go with her to make a trip there and to meet some family and so forth. So I did in the summer of 1991. So it's really the end of kind of the latter part of the Intifada. But nonetheless, there was much going on at that time. First, we were subject to a lot of the curfews that was discussed, where you have to stay home, for hours on end. You knew that it's coming because a particular siren would ring to indicate it's time for a curfew. We witnessed, things like electricity cutoffs, water cutoffs, and all the things that were mentioned in the film. But probably the most enlightening experience I had was that I told my mother that there was a Palestinian American organization that was organizing a trip to visit some different towns, because I was pretty much moving from Bethlehem, where my mother's from, to Ramallah, where many of my dad's relatives ended up, and a couple other cities, but not really moving outside of certain urban circles. So I told her I wanted to join this Palestinian American delegation on a tour. And it was quite a fascinating tour. We ended up visiting some refugee camps at the time to look at the conditions and really many of the poor living conditions that refugees were still experiencing. But we also visited a lot of associations, including women's associations. And what was fascinating, and what I was blinded, even though I was somewhat active in Chicago on some of the issues too, was on the ground governance and organizing that was happening. So we visited a hospital, and we learned about some of the medical associations that were organizing to try to ensure medical care was provided. So it was one of the committees that was formed. We visited a teacher who explained that while all the schools had been shut down at the time, there was an informal network of coordinating for hosting schools in vacant spaces. So there was a lot of exchange going on. Do you have an empty garage? Do you have, some space that we can meet? And so that also, I think, came out in the film as well. And we did a day trip to Gaza where we also met people in medical and in other kinds of service provision that had been well organized. One of them appeared a few times in the film. It was Haider Abdel Shafi, who used to be the head of a hospital in Gaza. He's passed away since then, but it was interesting to see his image again. And so it was quite a phenomenal moment in history, a particular junction in history where all these associations formed to fill immediate needs, but also not just for immediate needs, but had ultimately a political project of building an independent state. And you really saw the state formation on the ground, that these institutions were being developed, were being coordinated under unbelievable constraints. You saw in the film how somebody who even had any association with a political party could be arrested and had potentially attended a meeting could be arrested. And it was also telling at this time that everybody had a member of their family in jail. And they usually were male members. I had a cousin in jail. He was a teenager and throwing rocks. I had a couple, several, now that I think about it. We have a big extended family. Anyways, so inevitably there were quite a number, probably. But in and out. Some of them were in and out, too. Anyways, but at the time, I think this is the most critical thing, was that these associations formed, but there was, again, to meet the immediate needs, but there was also a long-term aspiration, a long-term vision, simultaneously, that was being worked in.
And maybe if we can do a comparison, because right now you're kind of doing work around cooperatives, women's cooperatives in Palestine, and kind of to think about what, we saw a bit of examples about how on the grounds and grassroots, and what's kind of the difference? Where would you say, is there a difference? Has that still been going on?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I guess in many ways, part of this research study pivoted around, what happens, right? And unfortunately, there's a striking difference between the women's associations today and those of this period. And it has to do with the shift more generally in Palestinian society post-Oslo. And it's very multifaceted, so I think I want to start briefly just by giving the context a bit more of Oslo and the signing of that agreement, and what it entailed for what would happen in the territories in the West Bank, which is where I'm doing most of my research. Unfortunately, I can't speak to what's been going on in Gaza. I haven't been back since that first visit. But in relation to the West Bank and the changes that have gone on, firstly, it's important to understand that what Oslo ushered in was this possibility of a phased independence in the territories. It would be gradual, but at the same time that this supposed gradual independence is happening, you have major settlement building and construction going on, as was suggested. But there's something else happening, and this is really telling of what happens to the restructuring of some of the associations and committees, which is that a lot of donor funding gets channeled into the West Bank. It becomes a huge destination for donor funds, many of which are coming from governments, a lot of European governments, US, Canadian governments, that are seeking to facilitate peace through these economic means rather than political means. So what happens as a consequence of this is you start to have really a neoliberalization of different levels of Palestinian society. The elite, the neoliberalization takes the form of what we see in a lot of major urban centers today, of major real estate investments and things like this, and you have like almost a bourgeois lifestyle now in some of these, like Ramallah, for example, and how that impacts things like the women's associations more specifically is that a lot of these donors, with this lens of an economic means to peace, view women's empowerment as one of those modes of intervention. And that women's cooperatives could be a medium through which to empower women, for Palestinians more generally to have better livelihood, quality of life, and then for peace to miraculously emerge from this kind of strategy. So one of the things that I'm doing research on and exploring is the way in which a lot of some of these very former women's committees or associations, some of them had women's centers, like physical spaces. Some of them didn't. There were more informal gatherings. But how some of them have been basically the kind of target in some ways for a lot of these policies, because there's already a consolidated group of women. So in some cases you have these women's cooperatives being formed out of some of the former women's associations. And the idea is that the donors would provide funding, sometimes provide equipment, provide training, so, and try to get the women to come around a certain kind of production, some kind of entrepreneurial strategy. Now, the challenge is twofold in comparison to what we saw in the first Intifada. First of all, it's heavily a top-down oriented strategy. Maybe somebody in a local NGO does research in collaboration with an international donor to determine that what's viable in the market. Oh, you should grow this product, and we'll give you maybe a piece of land or something, and you can specialize in this. So, for instance, a lot of people or you could tend to bees. Bees is a big thing among these, I have no idea why, and the production of honey and honey-related outputs and products. The thing is, it's a top-down thing. It's not driven from a bottom-up direction to begin with. And there's two other elements actually. It's not necessarily oriented to meeting an immediate need. Much of what you saw in terms of the coordination of the co-ops at the time of the Intifada was for self-sufficiency and to meet immediate needs too. It's not coming out of a shared need and a shared determination of those needs. It's coming from high up, down. And then finally, and this is ultimately, I think the most critical thing, is that it doesn't have a political end or objective. And when you're still under occupation, and you're striving to build up some form of economic livelihood in a place where you cannot control the land, the borders, the transport, the air, the water that you need to run any kind of business or operation, it's not viable. It's not sustainable. And what it does is it depoliticizes these associations and their activities. One other thing is, I've talked to a number of women who were active in the Intifada, who might have been leaders of different associations at the time. And they'll say, we're selling out. We've sold out, in some ways. Can you believe that we were there, we were on the street, we were on this. And so the two other consequences of this shift, and it's not that they don't still have political allegiances or aspirations for an independent Palestine. It's not that. And a lot of the women there are a lot of women that are still struggling in the present moment to build an alternative. So I don't want to generalize. I just want to see a trend that I've seen, that I've observed with some of the committees and associations that have been offered support, but the way the support comes in, what's most telling is most of those cooperatives have failed. And one interesting thing to come out of some of these failures, actually, is that the women have actually identified through coming together again to the reactivation of a kind of social concentration, of activity and stuff, is some of them have identified genuine local needs that they are considering pursuing, actually. So there is this some unexpected, byproducts of a very top-down arrangement which wasn't going anywhere, or at least not as hoped for by a lot of the international donors.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to, hear you describe this neoliberal policy that's kind of trying to create an illusion of a nationhood, right? There's a lot of conversations around Palestinian independence and nationhood and how, and you look at the dialogues now from the Palestinian Authority, and they kind of want to buy that illusion of nationhood that's created by this neoliberal kind of policy that really does not represent any needs on the ground, doesn't really actually actively encourage or actually, speak for any kind of communities that are outside of like small urban areas that are part of, whether it's women or political prisoners or kind of people living in direct occupation in, the military zones. So I wonder kind of, as within the global conversation about the continuing peace talks or kind of this idea of a two-state solution, at least for me it's clear that that's not a valid option with this kind of illusion of a state. And I wonder if that's how do you feel about that, or what kind of with your observations, what does that mean? What does this kind of Palestinian state mean in this neoliberal sense?
I think the biggest challenge to state formation now in a context of neoliberalism is that neoliberalism, and it does this everywhere as it touches down, not just in Palestine, but has a tendency to individualize. We become individuals who are competing for, a finite amount of resources, and in this case, the key resource that the struggle has been reoriented around is money and is profit and so forth. And so in the Intifada, what you saw, the first Intifada, was a real coming together of society. You didn't have the same conception of a division between somebody that's Fallahi, who from the outside rural area, and somebody is Madani, and it's from the city center, an urban setting, and you didn't have the same sense of the class divides dividing the movement. You had an unbelievable kind of collective presence, really a unified, as close, I think, as one can get. So what you're seeing now playing out in the current neoliberal context is a highly polarized society. You have people that are able to profit in this new kind of corrupt state-in-the-making, NGO-dominated economy, donor economy, which is apolitical in many ways, not willing to take strong stances against the occupation. And then you have those that continue to be excluded and marginalized. And so you have a real polarization within Palestinian society and movements. And part of it is also propped up by the spatial fragmentation of the territories, which I think also speaks to the challenges of today envisioning something like a two-state solution. There was much more territorial integrity in early 1990s, late 1980s, when the first Intifada had broken out. The idea of a two-people, two-state thing seemed, within reach, actually. And it seemed more within reach by 1991 when I was visiting because of all these associations and committees and the organization and the institutions and the kind of common agenda that people shared. There's no longer that sharing, and there's now, as noted, with all the settlement construction that happened after the signing of the peace accords, you have much more spatial fragmentation, territorial fragmentation than imagined, which makes it, which also separates people and their opportunities. Different spaces are conditioned by the occupation in highly different ways. Some have much more access to water, much more mobility than others. And so it's creating more divisions, actually, and making the two-state solution seem more illusory by the day. And just one other thought, I remember soon after the signing of the accords, I had an uncle in Ramallah at the time who was very passionate about the issues and so forth, and I remember him being very upset at what he saw was kind of a easily giving away of the territory or not holding strong on certain conditions like the halting to the settlements and so forth. And I remember him doing an interview and saying, the kind of peace that has been bought is an economic peace. And he said, and it's not P-E-A-C-E, it's P-I-E-C-E. He said, this is what's happened, and I think it's quite telling for what we're seeing today.
Maybe we can open up for a couple of questions.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to speak to that. I don't know. I mean, I think, definitely, there's a lot of technologies that are developed that can serve both civilian and military purposes simultaneously. And undoubtedly that, that probably puts pressure on moving forward with those kinds of developments, but I can't speak necessarily specifically to whether or not that coincides. It is interesting when you saw, the other thing that is critical to acknowledge that Oslo does economically with the signing of the treaty is that it facilitates the entry of Israeli goods into the West Bank. While still Israel has, in the sense of building connections between the potential two states that would be formed, while simultaneously we're seeing still heavy taxation, restrictions on things like inputs for Palestinian production if it comes in, for exports of Palestinian products, for anything that could enable an independent or viable economy, that this simultaneously becomes, constricted further and further in these, what were called the Paris Accords that were going on. And we saw that this is not surprising when considering in the film noting that there was boycott movements going on in the territories in the First Intifada and the impact it has on the economy. And I remember while I was there too, the stories I would hear from relatives that lived in a town called Beit Sahur, which is just outside of Bethlehem. And they were incredibly proud because they refused to pay taxes to the Israelis. And they were proud because their slogan was no taxation without representation. And, but one of the things also, again, even the resistance had taken so many different forms. And I guess that was the most surprising thing on my visit because, again, what I saw was filtered so heavily. Social media wasn't a thing back then, okay? But what I saw was heavily filtered by the US media. And you need to put that in perspective as well. And it was people throwing rocks and stone, and that was it. I didn't really see the different forms, it took really effort to explore the different forms and the manifestations that resistance would take, but there were a myriad of forms.
I mean, maybe just to add that I think it's important to, the Intifada came about as a result of all the violence that was happening. I think the violence just continued, right? I don't necessarily think that there is a use in kind of saying it increased. I think the whole point of the Intifada was kind of to point out just the extremity of the violence. Now, Israel's use of technology and the kind of global military system using Palestinians to test out new military technology is kind of, has been confirmed, and kind of really a lot of research is out there. I'm not personally kind of knowledgeable enough about it, but it is out there. But it is important to really note that sure, Israel's violence continued, I think, in the same violence that it had always kind of happened. I don't think there was necessarily an increase post-Intifada or post-Oslo. Oslo maybe gave them kind of on a global scale a way to justify and kind of say, right, we have this peace treaty, but they just continued doing what they've been always doing. But yeah.
It's interesting too, I've been doing some interviews with some of these women cooperatives, and most of the interviews, and I work with somebody there who's a student at Birzeit. She's a research assistant, and more than that, really, because my Arabic is rough, and you know, I don't have the sophistication to do the interviews. And one of the things she observed, she's quite a bit younger than me as well, but very optimistic. If anyone's gonna do it, she will. she'll free Palestine. But one of the things she noticed when we were going to the different women's cooperatives and the different women's associations was that there was an older demographic profile. That the women who were part of women's centers, women's community organizations and stuff, they were tended to be older, and they were complaining that it was hard to get the younger women to join in different activities and events, and it seemed that, you know, they didn't share some of that same thing. If an intifada, the next intifada will happen, it's going to happen in Gaza because of the conditions there. And we're already seeing it with the Great March. We shouldn't lose sight that the perseverance that the people of Gaza, the steadfastness of the people of Gaza today, they are the Intifada today. And what I'm seeing is really, to the extent that there's political organizing in any significant, I only make trips, you know, once or twice a year, but what I see in those limited kind of moments is the solidarity with Gaza is quite strong. And that's propelling some interesting, you know, trigger, I think. I'm ultimately optimistic because of, for one reason, the occupation proceeds. And as it proceeds, there will be people who suffer. And when people suffer, there will be resistance. I'm convinced. So there will, but we are seeing pockets of it, but it's mainly, I mean, this polarization is what, of society, is what makes it seem dissipated. But there still are pockets, and I think as long as there's an occupation, there will be resistance. Well, I mean, I think first what's most important is to acknowledge that there are some people that have been working on BDS here in Quebec for a long time. There's BDS Quebec, there's Tadaman, there's a lot of organizations already in existence that are really trying to promote BDS. So getting involved, being aware of what those organizations are, getting involved is really essential, because the effectiveness of the BDS is not doing it in isolation. It's really having a broader impact, a broader visibility. It's like you saw how she got out of jail because of a media campaign and the media attention. You know, those things are really also really, really critical, is to mobilize and to grow the visibility of it, because that's what's going to draw the attention, draw more people in, and draw awareness of what's going on. So, and there are a number of representatives here from Tadaman. Maybe you could stand up, some of you, Amy and Roar, and maybe there's others that I don't see. I'm sorry, my sight is not very good, even with my glasses on. So if there are others, I mean, it's, you know, these have been people who've been in it for the long haul and have a lot of, you know, background information. Its origins is 2005, but it's still a work very much in progress. Here at Concordia, you know, as Amy had already mentioned, the undergrads have a BDS mandate. The graduate students have a BDS. The association has a BDS mandate. And we have formed an organization, both Mohammed and I are involved in, called Academics for Palestine Concordia, that promotes BDS among other things. So if you're based here at Concordia and have an interest, you could also get in touch with us.
Thank you so much, Norma. This was really great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.